My parents own a pretty good chunk of property, large enough to include a small lake. I had been expressly forbidden to never go near the lake without any adult supervision. So, as a kid, you could imagine I was always itching to go near that body of water. That's not there was a lack of water for me to go near. There was actually a pond not that far away, and for whatever reason, there was no problem with me visiting the pond, but there would be fireworks and hell to pay. I never quite figured out the logic. The simple fact that it was forbidden was that it made it more inviting. As it often happens with many kids, I'm outside, unsupervised, and I got the idea to go take a visit. What my parents didn't know wouldn't hurt them. It wasn't like it was one of those places where you get a bad feeling just by being there. It was a very beautiful pond, and that particular day, the sun was shining, the weather gorgeous, made it all the more inviting. That's when I noticed something that I had never noticed before. A short distance into the lake was what looked like a segment of a pier or a dock, as if there was somebody had taken the pier apart, but failed to get one last segment of it that was out in the water. It was close enough that I would be able to swim to it. I was 11 years old, and I was a capable swimmer. I figured I was old enough to prove that I wasn't in any danger by being in or near the lake. I mean, I wasn't a baby anymore. I took off my clothes, jumped in the water, and I swam over to the small island of planks, being held up by heavy logs that reached far down into the water. I climbed up on the top, sat there, proud of myself, like any 11-year-old is of such a small feat. If only my parents could see me now, I thought. They would realize how grown up I am, and that I'm not just a little boy. My moment of triumph, though, was interrupted by movement next to the lakeshore. I want to say that I saw somebody, but the whole way it carried itself made it something. I mean, it had the overall shape of a man, albeit a very tall one, but there was something about the way it moved that seemed feral, almost like it was wearing clothes of some kind. The face was difficult for me to see. I couldn't see light reflecting off eyes. I couldn't see a nose or mouth. It appeared slightly hunched at the shoulders, making it look like it was skulking, even when it wasn't. It came to the water, and it began to wade out into it. Then the water went up to this thing's neck, and then it completely submerged. That was the last I had seen of it, but for some reason, it had completely scared me out of my wits. I was afraid to even move, let alone breathe. Quite a bit of time passed, and I was beginning to wonder if the thing was ever going to come for me, 'cause it surely would have reached me by then, if I was the reason it got in the water. Plus, my bladder was getting full, and suddenly, I heard angry shouting. My father. He was livid. He was throwing a bright orange raft onto the surface of the water and paddling out to get me. I jumped in the raft, deciding it was better than being in the water where I didn't know where that boogeyman was. My dad, not speaking a word, which is what he does when he is absolutely at his wit's end of anger. I knew I had it in. So, we silently paddled back to shore, and I looked back at the pier, and I thought the color drained from my face as I saw the head of that creature was poking up out of the water, just under the pier. It had been waiting for me the whole time. And in that moment, I understood why I was never allowed near the water. And after that incident, I never went there again, not even in my adult life. I got grounded for a long time after that. And when I asked my dad about it, if he had seen the thing, he wouldn't even acknowledge it, like he knew, but didn't want to bring it into reality. My mother played dumb about it too. Even to this day, I'm well into my 30s, and both refuse to even acknowledge or talk about it. Very strange. I'm from Illinois, and if you are from the same place, then you know that the city I'm in is home to 2 exceptionally large industrial processing plants. They manufacture soy and vitamin E. I don't know if I'm allowed to mention them by name or not. I work at one of those 2 places, and a number of the people in my family do as well, because where else can you get paid that kind of money, not knowing how to do anything? Push a broom, roll a paintbrush, don't get crushed, burned, impaled, or eaten. You don't know about things that can eat you unless you actually work at those places. Think about it. When you have places that separate vitamin E from other nutrients, it's impossible for them to capture all of it. Some of it goes out in the runoff, since it's environmentally safe, because after all, it's just food and vitamins. Well, unbeknownst to the casual outsider, there are rats and catfish that have nothing to do all day but eat that same runoff. They have no predators inside the facilities. So what do you think is going to happen to an animal that has no need to take shelter from predators and an endless supply of nutrient-densely packed food? They're going to increase in size. If this story makes it on air, I wholeheartedly challenge your listeners to fact-check the same story. My dad worked at one of these facilities before I did. He said that he and 3 of his coworkers were down by one of the lagoons when one of them accidentally dropped a torch in the water. As deep as their pockets are, you don't just go losing expensive equipment like that. Not if you're planning on a long-term career. The guilty part waded out into the water and found that it was deeper than he expected. Now you can imagine how foul the water must be, considering the state of the air when you go over the bridge over the entire facility. My dad's coworker was facing the prospect of having to go under the water to get the torch. Here's where everything happened quickly. The guy steeled himself, held his breath, went underwater. My dad glimpsed something dark and slick and shiny, with a long fin on its back, crest the water for just a moment. There was a brief disturbance in the water, and then it was over with. The guy never came back up. Dad and the other guy raised hell over it. But this is a corporation with incredibly deep pockets, which is why it's very dangerous to work here. There is no fine steep enough to force them into implementing any major safety programs. When something happens to one of their workers, they just reach into said deep pockets, pay off any fines or lawsuits, or anything else, and they bring in another warm body from the stack of applications of people who want to make decent money with literal no experience. I know that sounds like a bad plot to a science fiction movie, but honestly, it's the cold hard truth. They covered over the missing man's grave with money, just like they do with everyone else that suddenly isn't there anymore. My dad also swears up and down that for years afterwards, if he paid close enough attention, he would see a catfish the size of a shark in the lagoon. He never saw it completely exposed, but he always saw parts of it, or evidence of its presence. And it wasn't exactly small. Encounters with rats, the size of large cats, are a common experience out there. So it's not far-fetched to say there's one, if not more, catfish that are more than capable of swallowing a grown man. If you don't believe me, you are more than welcome to come out here and see for yourself. I lived in a small town that had a lake at the very edge of it. The lake was just about as big as the town. That either says something about how small the town was, or how big the lake was. Anyway, by the time I was 13 years old, I had a girlfriend that I spent just about every spare minute with that I could. My parents were more on the strict side, so they frowned on me spending any time with my girlfriend alone. After all, we never got into any real trouble. Any time that we actually had alone time, it was out in public. An expedition to the mysterious lake at the edge of town was just the right excuse to go for a nice long walk with my girlfriend and our chaperone, Dell, the border collie. We kept our eyes out for any signs that would say something like no trespassing or private property. But we didn't see anything. We didn't have any reservations about exploring. The waters are pretty still, with the exception of fish that would dart away when they see you. One of them was an exception. It lay there in the shallow waters, thrashing. It got my curiosity up, and I wondered if it was injured. It didn't look like any fish that I was used to seeing. It seemed to have a long body, and a peculiar pinkish blue color with shallow veins. Even in the daylight, I could tell that it had a few highlights of bioluminescence. I looked to see if maybe it was wrestling with some kind of parasite that had latched itself onto it, asking my girlfriend to find a stick so I could try to help it along. But it was when my girlfriend actually approached with the stick that Dell suddenly went berserk, and she put herself between us and this thrashing fish. She barked at it with all the fury I had never seen in her before. I tried to edge past her, but she refused to let me in. She even began lunging at this strange fish in the water, as if she were trying to intimidate it going away, which of course it wasn't. Then, she couldn't help herself. She attacked it. The minute she connected with it, something I can only describe as a giant leech coming up out of the water and totally enveloping my dog whole. The muscles on its body began crushing my dog, and the disturbing, traumatic sound of crunching bones, along with her muffled whimpers under this thing's flesh, crushing my sanity along with her body. The thrashing fish must have had some kind of organ that performed a similar function to that of an angler's fish lure. Look, it's hard for me to talk about. Part of me died that day. I had never seen or heard anything more horrible than what that thing had done to my dog before in my life. It's still something I don't really like to dwell on. My dog died a horrible death, and I had to see it. It was like watching something out of a horror movie, except this wasn't a horror movie. This was real life.